I want to talk today about a project that we ran this past summer looking at attitudes of the American public towards invasive species management. Now, my interest in this human dimensions of invasive species management really grew from my involvement working on the biological control of the aquatic plant water chestnut. Now, as I'm sure many of you on the call can appreciate, the communication of biological control is a difficult and controversial topic, and it's one that is a challenge frequently for me. And I knew that coming into this biological control project, that there's a lot of controversy around the topic of biological control. But what I did not have a good sense of was how the controversy of biocontrol surrounding biocontrol fit into the greater context of controversy that swirls around invasive species more generally. Now, at the broadest sense, this controversy is coming from the social and political environment that we are all involved in. And it's coming from different opinions about the correct answers to some of these questions on the slides. And those opinions are rooted in human values, which we know can vary widely between groups of people. And management decisions can be made in spite of these conflicting viewpoints, or can be avoided because of this conflict. But without knowing what is really influencing the support for action, little can be done to address the underlying controversy. And this controversy is important to explore. Invasive species management is frequently done with public dollars on public lands and for the express benefit of the public good, making the public an essential stakeholder here. And when management actions start to diverge from, this sense of social acceptability by the public, that rift can threaten the social license to operate of practitioners, and it can also threaten conservation outcomes. And another reason to keep exploring this controversy and dig a little deeper is because it's not going away, especially given the media and information ecosystem that we're all involved in. And so, working with this team of awesome collaborators, we designed an experiment to try to deconstruct this controversy swirling around invasive species management. And we were guided by these broad overarching questions of what is it about invasive species management that makes it more or less acceptable to people? And how does this acceptability vary across groups of people? And we came up with 4 different categories and characteristics of invasive species management that we thought might be important in influencing attitudes. The first category that we wanted to know was, does the targeted organism of management affect acceptability? So is management of an insect thought of differently than management of a plant? The second category, and kind of the original inspiration for this project, is wanting to know how attitudes towards these different control methods stack up against each other. Is biological control really more controversial than chemical control? And the third and fourth factors we wanted to explore both relate to risk. Now, risk is inherent in all management decisions, including the decision not to take any action at all, and whether that's communicated explicitly or not. And we also know from our fields of invasive species that these perceptions of risk affect social acceptability of actions, and that these acceptability and perceptions of risks change over time. And so we wanted to be really explicit about risk in invasive species management, and we included it in this experimental design. So we wanted to know, do attitudes towards management differ, whether the risk associated with that action is in a low category or a high category of risk, and whether those risks affect native species or human well-being. And the tool that we use to bring this experiment all together is something that is called experimental vignettes. And these are short and simple narratives describing an invasive species scenario. And you can think about this as an experimental Mad Lib where we are behind the scenes manipulating where we are putting in these different experimental factors within these stories. And these vignettes include a careful use of language and this trade-off between the comparability of these vignettes and also the detail that we can put into these vignettes. And so when we go back and think about this experimental design that I just communicated and look at all these different factors and the levels of those factors, you can come up with 24 different combinations here. The arrows connecting these different levels are just one of these 24 combinations. And for each of these 24 combinations, we wrote one of these experimental vignettes for that situation. Here's what one of these experimental vignettes looks like, and I'm going to read it out loud. An insect species has arrived in a place where it didn't previously exist and is causing negative effects on the environment. Local natural resource managers are confident that they can substantially improve the situation by introducing an additional species of insect to kill the problematic insects. There's a high risk that releasing the additional insect will harm native species in the local area. So here, outlined in red and the underlined text here, you can see where we put in these experimental factors, and you can kind of get a sense of how we manipulated them. But equally as important is the text that's not underlined. And I want to point out a few things here. So you can notice here that this situation describes a biological control scenario, but you don't see that term included in this description. And this was very purposeful. We chose to avoid the jargon of biological control or chemical control, mechanical control, and instead directly describe the mode of action associated with these different control efforts. Now, another very conscious decision that we made was we do not talk about the origin of the problematic species, whether it's native or non-native. We just simply say that it has arrived in a place, and you don't see the term invasive at all in these vignettes. So after we describe this situation, following each one of these scenarios, there's this acceptability statement. It would be acceptable for the managers to blank. And then we asked people how strongly they agreed or disagreed with this sentiment. And by converting this acceptability to this numeric value, then we're able to run some statistical models to get a sense of what best predicts this acceptability of invasive species management. We conducted this experiment on Qualtrics. It was an online experiment, and we hired Qualtrics Business Services to recruit for us a representative sample of adults living within the US. And we had that sample stratified, so it's a representative sample. Working with Qualtrics, we recruited 1,200 individuals, and we paid them for their participation in this study. And there were two parts to the participant experience. They would come into the survey and they would randomly be assigned to only 4 of these 24 possible vignettes. And they would see the scenario, they would respond to it, and then they would move on to the next one. And after they responded to 4 of these, there was a sequential demographic questionnaire where we asked them some characteristics about themselves. And by taking the information that was embedded in the vignettes that these participants responded to and taking the demographic information that they provided us, we were able to combine this information into a model in which we look to see what combination of factors here best predicts the acceptability of invasive species management. And here's what our results look like. And I'm going to take a minute to explain what we're looking at here. So in each of these 4 quadrants, on the x-axis, we have the control method. On the y-axis, we have the acceptability. So anything above this neutral is a positive acceptability, and anything below this neutrality is a negative acceptability. Each one of these bars represent one of those 24 possible vignettes I was describing. The colors correspond to whether the situation was about an insect being managed or a plant being managed. And then in the columns here, we have this high risk scenario and the low risk scenario. And then we have in the rows whether the risk was to human well-being or the risk was to native species. And so what did we find? Well, maybe your eyes are already taking you to one of the more obvious trends here, which is this increasing acceptability from high-risk scenarios to low-risk scenarios. And this is something that we predicted, and I'm sure you would have predicted as well, right? People are more comfortable with a low-risk management option. The more interesting finding relating to risk, though, is that risk does not predict this significant finding we have, where control method is a really strong indicator of acceptability, with biological control being a clear loser, chemical control being slightly more acceptable, and then mechanical control having the highest acceptability. And this trend and this finding was independent of whether we told people this was associated with a high risk scenario or a low risk scenario. So these attitudes are really hard baked in about control method. We have a few other interesting findings here. One is that attitudes towards the management of plants are no different from the attitudes towards the management of insects. And maybe more interestingly, and against my prediction, attitudes towards management scenarios in which risk is to human well-being are thought of no differently than scenarios when the risk is to native species. We also find that this acceptability varies depending on who you ask, and especially when it comes to high-risk scenarios, which are depicted here in the red lines. So men are more accepting of high-risk acceptability than women. We find that people who identify as Hispanic are more accepting of high risk than non-Hispanics. And we find this really strong interaction where the acceptability of high risk declines pretty dramatically with age. And so the goal of this project was really to make broad generalizations across the American public about attitudes towards invasive species management. And we're able to really confidently have these conclusions based on our large sample size, our sample that looks like America, and a sample that is a research experimental design in which we can disentangle what's driving these attitudes. But what's important to communicate here is that this experiment measured how people feel and not why they have these opinions or feelings. And another thing I just want to point out here is, by necessity, we tested only a subset of characteristics that define invasive species management. We argue that they're very important, but of course there are additional things that could change these attitudes. But we have this really strong statistical basis now to make these conclusions about these generalizations of how people feel towards these different invasive species characteristics. And building off of this, we can then design additional experiments to dig into this a little bit further. And so interpreting some of our results and thinking about these next future directions are really exciting. So why do these differences exist in attitudes towards control methods? Our study can't answer this, but we can start to speculate, informed speculation, and design experiments to drill down further. So one idea that we have that might explain some of these differences is this sense of familiarity. Many people have either direct or indirect experience with pulling weeds from some place that they don't like, or using chemicals to, kill something. And so there's this exposure in the media, there's this awareness of what managers are doing, but there's also kind of this household experience and familiarity. And even if they have some skepticism or some idea that chemicals are risky or something, there's a good chance that people have some familiarity with this. They might even have some of these chemicals in their garage or something. Now, another interesting concept here that could explain some of these differences, particularly relating to biocontrol, is this idea of irreversibility. And this is an interesting one because advocates of biocontrol would say, hey, if you have a safe and effective insect, for example, that you could release, and it successfully establishes that insect's going to be doing this work for us long term, right? This is a sustainable solution grounded in ecology. But the flip side of that same coin that biocontrol critics harp on is kind of, well, once you open Pandora's box, there, if that insect successfully establishes, you're not putting that back in the box. And so this concept of irreversibility could be driving some of these differential attitudes. So one of the most interesting findings to me in all of this is this idea of the risk target. And my prediction was that, when risks are to human well-being, people are going to be much more conservative with their acceptability, but that is not what we find. And so this could really be a challenge to the narrative of human self-interest, right? Maybe we as humans care more about the environment than is talked about. Alternatively, though, this could be a reflection of our poor ability to judge risks. Humans are notoriously bad at judging risks, especially when it's a future risk. They discount the risk to themselves when it's in the future. And so this is an interesting line of thought that we want to develop further. Now, back to where all of this started, and something that I'm really excited to elaborate on further with additional studies, is this clear finding that biocontrol has a public relations problem. Now, this probably isn't new to you, but we have some new insights from it from our experiment. And so we can design additional experiments using this vignette approach to drill down further into why people hold these attitudes. But we could also use a similar approach to explore the effectiveness of different communication campaigns and what framework could elicit the most positive response towards biological control. And so, for example, you could think about a vignette in which you write describing a scenario and you're alternating and manipulating the benefits of biocontrol or the risks of biocontrol. And you could think about, having one vignette talking about the really positive safety record of weed biocontrol and the regulatory oversight that is associated with the process. You could have another where you're talking about the natural solution that is biocontrol, where you're leveraging ecological and evolutionary interactions to do this work for us. And then you could also have one where you're talking about the economic cost and benefits of biocontrol. And by testing these together in a framework similar to what I just laid out, we can continue to drill further into not only why people have these attitudes, but what could be the most effective communication campaigns for promoting some of these ideas. And with that, I would like to conclude, and hopefully we have a few minutes for questions. And again, thank you for the invitation to talk about this project.